Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you for this particular event today. And we have a special agenda. We're launching a very key project, and we'll go through, I have speakers both from the DG NEAR, European Commission, UNDP, and we're launching this very important project and strategic partnership. And we have a keynote speaker, Professor John Kay, who accepted to join us. So without further ado, and let me first introduce the European Commission Director for the Eastern Neighborhood, Lawrence Meredith, who will give an introductory remark. Lawrence, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. And Professor Kay, it's a great pleasure and honor that you join us today. I have to say, I'm extremely curious to hear from you on the subject of obliquity, a word with which I only recently became familiar, if I'm honest. So I've heard Bin chose to present this at our directorate team building only a month or so ago. And now I'm absolutely thrilled because he opened our curiosity on this subject and we had a very stimulating and informal exchange. And so now I'm delighted to welcome our good friends from the UNDP, as well, of course, from all our colleagues in DG NEAR. It's a really important event for us today. I've been in this job over 5 years, and if there's one thing I'm well known for, I'm passionate about our work at the local level. I don't come from the capital of my country, as I often say. I come from a small village with more cows than people. And when I go around the Caucasus in particular, but also the other parts of the Eastern Partnership, I'm struck always by how similar that rural-urban divide is, and especially between the capitals and the regions. And that's why I'm passionate about our local networks. And we started with the Covenant of Mayors about 10 years ago, and it was such a success that we decided that, having done a lot of good work on energy efficiency, we would also extend this local network and launch the Mayors for Economic Growth, which I had the pleasure of doing, launching the first phase. And it's amazing to think in the short time we've been working together, that's grown from nothing to over 250 municipalities across the 6 countries of the Eastern Partnership. That's simply awesome. And then we're living in unprecedented times. I mean, if I quote Yunus Muhammad, coronavirus has suddenly changed the context and the calculus of the world. It's opened up audacious possibilities that never existed before. And suddenly we have a tabula rasa. We have unbelievable freedom of choice, and we can choose to walk in any direction. And, it's a big moment for us. These come round every 7 years. I've been of a century in the European Commission. And I like these moments of change. I like the dynamism that they bring. I like launches. I like this injection of energy. I like partnerships. So I'm delighted, really delighted to have UNDP. And I like new and original ideas. So really, it's an honor to have you with us, Professor Kay. The tabula rasa for us is that we start with a new budget, which only comes every 7 years. That means we can come up with all sorts of new ideas. We start with a new vision. Last year, we set out a vision of 5 policy priorities. And let me briefly list them to set the context. First and foremost, following the dreadful pandemic, it's investing in the economy and connectivity, getting the recovery kick-started. That's absolutely crucial. The second and third priorities relate to this new opportunities, to the tabula rasa. We must build back better. And I think the 2 biggest game changers we see are going green. There's no planet B. I was talking to the students of the College of Europe in Natalin earlier this week about the fundamental importance of investing in the green transition, and that this is a whole economy approach, but also digital. And again, earlier this week, we were in partnership with the World Bank looking at what more we could do in digital. And there I like to provoke and say, everybody says it's a no-brainer, we need to go digital. We're all going digital, otherwise we couldn't even have this discussion. But yet we don't put the money that we put into more traditional investments like transport or energy into digital. And there is the potential and there is the need to invest that money in digital to make the real change. So I think, and you know, as we talk about opportunities for mayors for economic growth, guys, look at the green areas, look at the digital opportunities. I've seen fascinating innovation labs across the Eastern Partnership. I've seen really innovative green approaches in local schools in Moldova. All of this stuff that, you know, you can kickstart at the local level, things that maybe national governments don't have the courage to take on as a national policy yet. You can experiment. I mean, I think, and I'll be very interested to hear what Professor Kay says about this, it's important to have the space to fail as well. Not every innovation is going to work, but if we don't have the courage to take risks and learn from those failures, we'll never find the right road forwards. So I truly believe, and it's not that common in the public service, but I think, you know, if you stand still, you never move forwards. So you have to look at the change that is coming, anticipate, discuss, and that's why partnership is so really important. And of course, I talked to the three priorities. That's the investment pillar, if you like. Investing in the economy and connectivity, investing in green, and investing in digital. But for any of this to work, you need to have the right conditions in society. And that's where the other two priorities come in, what we call the governance pillar. And that means you've got to have rule of law, you've got to tackle corruption, and above all, and I've often said that I see this as the single biggest challenge for the Eastern Partnership countries, you've got to have justice reform. People, to invest, you've got to have investor confidence, and that means you've got to have confidence you will get your rights through a court of law. And then if we look across the Eastern Partnership, how important is it, this basic right of democracy? We stand by the people of Belarus, we see the challenges they face, and we see how important it is to have a vibrant independent media, to have vibrant young people. And I do believe that students can, and young professionals can make a big, big difference. But, you know, above all, this is where the local level comes in. If we're going to have inclusive societies, it's got to, we've got to think global and act local. And I think, you know, I'm very, very proud of the achievements of the first phase of the Mayors for Economic Growth. I'm excited to hear what John's going to be saying in a moment about obliquity and achieving goals indirectly. And I'd really like to welcome again the launch of a new partnership with UNDP to explore, to experiment, and to test ways to build a better tomorrow as we go into this second phase of the Mayors for Economic Growth. I wish you all tremendous success in this initiative. I'm excited to be part of it, and I'm looking forward very much to what Professor Kay is going to share with us. So, Bin, I hand back to you, and thank you all very much. I wish us a successful and productive launch debate this afternoon.
Thank you, Lawrence. And let me have the honor to invite UNDP Deputy Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia, Agi Veres. Not only she is the Deputy Regional Director for Central Asia, but she was critical in shaping this project and in building this partnership. So Agi, the floor, the screen is yours. Agi.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much, Lawrence, for the introduction. I'm super excited to be here, and I was very happy to hear your introductory words, especially the license to fail. We will quote you on that if something goes wrong. But joke aside, really, I am absolutely excited about this project, and then we got to this point within a year. And within what year? You know, within a year where we could hardly see each other. This project was a brainchild over dinner. I can't even imagine that we would be able to launch this now over dinner or even have the first steering committee over dinner, unfortunately. So despite all of these challenges, we really have come a long way. I think for two organizations that are are labeled as two big bureaucracies like the EU and UNDP. This is why we are all excited, because I think with your support and with our engagement, we have created a space that's very unusual. You know, a space where we can experiment, a space where we can show that actually we can do development in a different way. I think for both for you and us, we are doing a lot of things. We have huge portfolios that we manage. A lot of them are business as usual. A lot of them are must-dos, and there are the gems. You know, the gems that you enjoy because you believe in it and you think it's exciting, and you manage to create some kind of cohesion with partners and like-minded people who want to do something differently. And the reason why this project is more than a gem, I think it's a diamond, because a lot of the times these gems are small with very little impact, experimenting, piloting, doing something on a small scale. And I think this project, while it's not enormous, I think it will give us an opportunity to combine this kind of passionate new way of thinking and taking it forward, but also doing it, building on what you have already started, as you said, now with so many municipalities involved, but building on it in a way that I think will actually have impact, and that will have not just impact as per the project, but also trickling down impact on both the content of it and the substance, but also how we envision the future of development, how we want to work at the local level, not just us as development professionals supporting the process, but somehow nurturing a new way of local development management with the leaders at the local level in this region. So because of all of this, I think this is really a very special project, a very, very special partnership. We have many projects with you, and this is one of those that I think we all kind of excited when we meet and talk about it, and maybe some of the others are a bit more business as usual, but maybe this will give us the opportunity to take things forward in a different way. So really want to, first of all, very much appreciate your support, your openness, and your trust in us. And I think being in this journey together will be very exciting, and we will do our best, and we'll pay special attention to make sure that this experimentation is enjoying the biggest support that we can offer in all our capacity. And of course, a special thank, Mathieu, to you and Bin. I have thoroughly enjoyed this dialogue and this journey with you, and I'm very happy to go to the next stage with you. So with that, I just want to mention a few more substantive things that is at the heart of this project, which of course is about transformation and testing out new ways of achieving development goals, applying a system lens, engaging a well-designed exploration and discovery. So there are a few aspects of it that I think we will need to make sure that we don't forget as we start the implementation, that we don't shift into an implementation business as usual mode. I mean, one is the changing context and the experience of uncertainty and complexity that we are faced with. And when we dreamt up this project, COVID wasn't even on the menu. And I think now what you said and the quote you gave from Mohammed Yunus, I think this is exactly why this is a good opportunity and an extremely good timing that we couldn't anticipate to do a project like this. This has implications on design of single point solutions to portfolios, delivery cycles, all of these things that I think there is a much more space and openness and interest from partners to embrace these solutions through a rigorous discovery and learning. And from our UNDP perspective, this is a shift towards strategic thinking and innovation embedded across the organization. And our strategic plan and discussions are very much focusing on these issues. And at the heart of the development is the local development, as you said. If we look at major issues such as climate change, urbanization, and everything else, the impact will be at the local level. The largest impact is if we change at the local level. So if we can create these kinds of partnerships that are core to this path and shift to longer term engagements, that will make a huge difference. So as I said, then this mayor's project comes at a very opportune moment. And at first glance, it may not be so new to our partners and UNDP. We jointly are embarking on a next phase of a local development project. But I think what is very clear that it is very new, because the context shows that new models of delivering are absolutely necessary. And what this requires is also a different way of engaging. They require listening, iteration, and learning. So this kind of offering that we have developed, the set of processes and tools that enable us in the region and beyond to develop these cross-cutting portfolios will be the basis for the work in the Mayor's project. Of course, complemented with innovative methods of design and sustainable and growth trajectories. Now, it is also, I think what I want to emphasize is an aspect that it's an invitation to not be stuck in patterns of our past and learn from both institutions, but looking at how we are going towards the future. And that's why this strong partnership with Mathieu, Bin, Stephen and their team and the engagement from the country office is an absolutely good start to it. We have the privilege today to have John Kane here with us, and I'm very much looking forward to also, as Lawrence said, some of your thoughts on this and delve into further explaining how the field of economics may have ignored some important aspects of how the world works. And I think this would be very inspirational and very much in line with the spirit of this project. I don't want to dominate the stage here long because otherwise it sounds like I'm filibustering and I'm being between you and the real speaker. So I just want to close by saying that I really truly believe that this is not just an event that we're all excited about, but it's a transformation that we're all craving. We all have our work and our limitations around us, but at the end of the day, I do believe that both at the EU, UNDP, we work at these organizations because we want to see change, we want to bring transformation. And I see this as an enormous opportunity to do that. And I can see, and talking to country office colleagues, we have now an opening to take this enthusiasm to our partners at the local level, who will hopefully then transfer this to their surroundings. So I think this is a changing world more than ever. And this is a start to discovery of new things and testing solutions that were not done before. And as I said, we will deploy our full capacity to make sure that this will be a success. And in this journey, I hope to be in regular touch with you so that we feel this is a true hand-holding partnership in the process. And then we can take this forward together. So let me stop there and hand it back to Bin. And I think we're all ready to the main event of the keynote speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Aggie, for the nice words. So let me have the privilege to introduce Professor John Kay. So Professor John Kay is an economist whose career has spanned the economic world, the business and finance world, and public affairs. He has held shares, among other things, at the London Business School, at the University of Oxford, at the London School of Economics. He's a fellow at St. John's College, Oxford, where he began his academic career in the 70s. He's a director of several public companies. He's a contributor to the Financial Times. He's the author of many books, including Obliquity, Radical Acidity. His books has received a lot of prizes. I'm not going to name them. But I have to say also, and let me add the personal touch, I mean, he's an inspiring writer. I mean, if this program comes out of reading your books, and I'm really honored, pleased, and happy that you accepted our invitation to come and share a little bit of your thinking with us civil servants who are striving to make this place a better world. Professor John Kay, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ben, and it's a pleasure for me and an honor to be invited to help launch your program. You've just mentioned two books which I've written at an interval of 10 years, one called Obliquity, one called Radical Uncertainty. They both come out of really a single strand of thought, which is we know much less about the world than we often pretend to. And we need not to pretend we do have more knowledge, but actually to really understand better how we cope with a radically uncertain environment which we face. Let me begin, if I could have the first slide, please. That's the advertising slide for the book. Perhaps we could move on to the substance and go on to my next slide. You may be rather bewildered by what this appears to be. What it is NASA's description of the trajectory which they launched of a rocket which they launched in 2004. The purpose of it was to make observations of Mercury. And to launch Mercury is quite far away, on average about 50,000 miles, but a rocket launched directly reaches there relatively quickly, less than 6 months. What NASA wanted to do, however, was put a rocket in orbit around Mercury. And in order to do that, they had to plan a trajectory like the one that is illustrated in this slide. It's a, as you can see, complex trajectory. It took the rocket 4 years to reach Mercury, and it was 7 years before it went into orbit as planned round Mercury. And it went into orbit as planned round Mercury. 7 years after launch, the rocket was more or less exactly when NASA had planned it to be 7 years earlier. Now that's a remarkable feat of computation and, in a sense, prediction. And it's understandable that people would like to believe that our business, our financial world, our political world could be controlled and managed in a rather similar way. But there are at least 3 things that characterize that problem, which do not characterize the problems which we typically face. The first of all is that we know what the equations of planetary motion and of rockets are. It's a known system, well understood. It has been understood for hundreds of years. It's complete. Our knowledge is, in this sense, complete. It's also a stationary system. That is, it's the same as it was several hundred years ago when these equations were first written down. Obviously, the planets move, but they move in entirely predictable ways. So the system is stationary in that sense. The third is that it is not affected either by what we think about it or by what we do. The equations of motion of Mercury are independent of when we send rockets. They're also independent of what we think they are. Mercury does not know and does not care what we believe about its motions. None of these things are true of the systems which we normally face in business, politics, finance, and indeed our everyday lives. Our knowledge isn't complete, the systems are not stationary, and they are deeply affected by our actions and our beliefs about them. And we have to cope with a world in which that is the case. But the 20th century was characterized by many attempts, essentially the modernist revolution, to claim that we could manage our environment in a similar way to that. Could I have the next slide, please? Le Corbusier, the Swiss architect, famously described a house as a machine for living in. And he built in Marseille the first tower blocks, which you can see on the left, upper left of this screen. Here's Unité d'Adaptation at Marseille, which you can still see in the outskirts of Marseille. Although you cannot now see many of the tower blocks which were built subsequent to Le Corbusier's pioneering work. You can't see them because they've been pulled down. One architectural historian said that the age of modernism ended in 1971 when the city of Chicago demolished some of the tower blocks that it had built in the 1950s. Because a house isn't a machine for living in. A house is a home, and the machines that were built for living in were not actually where a lot of people wanted to live. I've contrasted Unité d'Adaptation with France's architectural gem in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, Notre Dame. Notre Dame took 200 years to build. In a sense, we don't know who built it, because there are a whole series of architects who contributed to that construction over 2 centuries, but over the 6th century, 7 centuries now since it was completed, everyone has regarded this as one of the great buildings of the world. Not necessarily Le Corbusier, however. Le Corbusier is a plan for Paris, a famous plan constructed in the plan of Voisin. And if we look at the next slide, we can see it. That's what Le Corbusier thought Paris should be like. If you look down at the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, on the island there, I think that is Notre Dame in that particular plan. I don't think it was planned actually to erase it, but it was certainly to be overwhelmed by the blocks which were to be erected on the right bank of the Seine. Fortunately, the plan was never actually implemented, but some similar plans were implemented elsewhere in the world, as in the next slide. Perhaps the most famous of all the planned cities, which is Brasilia. You can probably see it wasn't designed by Le Corbusier, it was designed by Niemeyer, but you can see affinities between the design which is there and the design which was put forward for Paris. And in fact, Corbusier did get to design the city of Chandigarh in India. And if we look at that on the next slide, this is the Chowda, the piazza, which is at the center, what Europeans might call a piazza, the square, which is at the center of most Indian towns. This is what it looks like in Chandigarh. If we look at the next slide, however, we can see what it looks like in Delhi, which is the way in which, or much more, the way in which Indians see the nature and the uses of a chowda. Of course, it wasn't just in these parts of the world, in Brasilia, in India, that people had visions of this kind. In New York, there was a great, as it were, builder of modern New York, who was Robert Moses. Any of you who have ever been to New York will have been frustrated by the traffic which is involved in getting from the airports of New York into Manhattan. If you wonder why you're sitting in a queue of traffic, then the reason is that Robert Moses designed the expressways that way, or at least he designed them to be limited in the amount of traffic he could take. He built, in particular, he ensured that the bridges over the Van Wyck Expressway were relatively low, so that the capacity of the road to assume traffic was limited, because he wanted to keep Long Island as essentially a plutocratic oasis for a relatively small number of people. And he quite consciously avoided the central reservation, on which one might, for example, have built a light railway that would take one very quickly into the center of Manhattan. Moses had a rather clear design for New York. He thought he knew what that city should be, and the result was the chaotic city on that outside Manhattan, which we have today. The opposition to, most effective opposition to Moses and his plan came from Jane Jacobs in a great book called The Life and Death of Great American Cities. And what Jacobs explained and articulated in that book was why Chandni Chowk, which I must say no one would quite want to replicate in that particular form, but why that works and why Brasilia and Chandigarh do not work. It's the unplanned interactions which are part of the vibrancy of city life which make the difference. And this is not just a social phenomenon, it's an economic phenomenon, because it's the coming together of different people exchanging ideas in an unplanned framework and which enables us to have the innovation and the inventiveness which we have. And of course, at the moment, people are congratulating themselves on how much they're able to do on Zoom. I'll come back to this, but you might well note that there are rather few of these unplanned interactions in Zoom. If you talk to someone on Zoom, it is because someone has scheduled a Zoom meeting. Of course, the rise of modernism of this kind wasn't just a matter of town planning and architecture. In many ways, the largest impact of the world of believing that we knew more than we did was in business. And if we have a look at the next slide, we can see a classic example of that. The Boeing Company, from 1945 to the late 70s, became the world's most successful civil aviation manufacturer. Bill Allen, who ran that company of that period, described how he wanted to run the business. We aim to eat, sleep, and breathe the world of aeronautics. In the 1960s, Boeing pioneered the 727, the 737, and the 747. The 737, the most successful, the most popular airline. There are still more planes, 737s flying today than any other aeroplane that has ever been built. And the 747, of course, was the jumbo jet that transformed intercontinental travel, made travel cheap and possible over long distances. When a non-executive director of the Boeing Company asked if there had been proper DCF calculations of the profitability expected from the 747, he was told that someone had done sums a bit like that once, but no one could quite remember where they were or what the results of them have been. These planes were built by people who lived, dreamt, breathed the world of aeronautics. More recently, around the turn of the century, the culture of Boeing changed. And Phil Condit, who was CEO of Boeing at that time, explained it. We weren't going to eat, sleep, and breathe the world of aeronautics anymore. We're going into a value-based environment where unit costs, return on investment, shareholder return are the measures by which you'll be judged. That's a big shift. It was a big shift, actually. And you can see the final results of that big shift over the last 2 years. What happened with the 737 MAX. 737, as I described, is the best-selling airliner in the history of civil aviation. And rather than design a new plane to compete directly with Airbus, who have been overtaking Boeing in the global market, Boeing chose to effect a simple redesign of the 737 in order to enable it to use more fuel-efficient engines. Well, we know what the result of that was in terms of the crashes in 2018 and 2019, which so damaged that plane, so damaged that company's reputation, and have created an environment from which Boeing will struggle to recover. And if you look at the congressional inquiry into the 737 incidents, the 737 MAX incidents, you will understand the culture in Boeing and the failures of regulatory culture which led to that particular outcome. But as was being said in the introduction, a lot of people in economics have believed that we can frame our language and our thinking in the same kind of ways that made NASA so successful in sending Messenger to Mercury. For example, one of the leading Chicago economists of our time, Robert Barrow, at a seminar which I went to 10 years ago, said, next slide, please. From a political perspective, he said, the main force behind the formation of the European Union and the adoption of the euro was likely the desire to avoid a repetition of World War II. That is to reduce the disaster probability, P, applicable to war. And if you read Barrow's paper, you will then see some fairly complex mathematics focused around the disaster P, probability P, applicable to war. What is the disaster probability P applicable to war? How would one go about calculating it? I suppose one might say, and people really do calculations like this, that since 1900 we've had 2 global wars. That's 120 years divided by 2. The probability of having a world war in any particular year is 1 in 60. But that kind of calculation only has to be spelled out for us to see how absurd it is. I can promise those of you who read Nate Silver's book on the uses of probabilistic reasoning in a whole variety of fields, that there is a calculation of the probability that there would have been an incident like September 11 using exactly the kind of methodology which I've described. It's worth looking at the next slide to see what the people who set up the European Union really thought when they were doing it. This is Jean Monnet, the domain in which I wanted to act, that of preparing for the future, which by definition, he said, is not illuminated by the light of current affairs. I think Andrew Schonfield, a British author, famously described the European Union as a journey to an unknown destination. And of course, that is what it is. The EU is trying to create something that is neither simply a new state nor a federation of individual states. It's essentially a new innovation in human economics, politics, and history. And that's the kind of vision which Monnet and Schuman and the people who set up the European Union had in mind. They were not attempting to calculate the probability of war P and calculate what the implications of that would be for their thinking. But that has been the tradition of economic models over the last century. There certainly was a 20th century economist who was quite clear you couldn't think simply in these terms. If I could have the next slide, please. Could we have the sound on that?
By uncertain knowledge, I do not mean merely to distinguish what is known for certain from what is only probability. The sense in which I am using the term is that in which the prospect of a European war is uncertain, or the price of copper, or the rate of interest in 20 years hence, or the obsolescence of invention, or the position of private wealth owners in the social system in 1970. About these matters there is no scientific basis to form any calculable probability whatever. We simply do not know.
That was what Keynes wrote. It was part of what underpinned Keynes' thought, but it's an insight which has really been disputed by economists ever since. And indeed, Keynes had a contemporary called Frank Knight, who was then at Chicago and presented rather similar arguments in a book published simultaneous with his. But actually, they were both overtaken by a style of thought which grew out of the work that was done during the Second World War, and which led Milton Friedman in the 1950s famously to write, we may treat people as if they attached probabilities to every conceivable event. And that's the world which creates the thinking, which leads to our calculating or purporting to calculate the probability of war P and feed that into our economic models. And if you want to see both the use and the misuse of economic modeling, you can see it in the ways in which people have responded to epidemiological modeling in the course of the pandemic. That illustrates, to my mind, both the ways in which modeling can be useful and the way in which it isn't useful. The way in which it is useful is enabling us to understand the parameters which determine, which underpin a model. That is, we can see from relatively simple epidemiological models the way in which the reproduction rate, that is the number of people who are infected by any infected person, determines essentially the shape of the pandemic. We can also introduce a bit more sophistication and see that having different reproduction rates in different groups makes a big difference to the way these numbers evolve. So that we can get a great deal of insight from a model into the parameters we need, the information we need, in order to be able to determine policy and anticipate not what will happen, but the kinds of things that might happen. That's an appropriate way of using models. It's very different from the way of using models which comes up, as people did come up with, of predictions of the number of infected cases that would be, which run to 2 or 3 significant digits. There are no models which can actually generate information of that kind. So I believe that Keynes is right in what he said there, and that we need to think about rather differently about the ways in which we approach uncertainty. Now, we framed our thinking around a concept of radical uncertainty, and nothing could have illustrated better for us the nature of radical uncertainty than the COVID pandemic. We actually say in the book, Radical Uncertainty, whose manuscript was completed in the summer of 2019, we say we must expect to suffer from a pandemic created by some virus which does not yet exist. This is not extraordinary prescience. We certainly did not know that that virus would, within 6 months, come into being and exist. It is describing things that are likely, but where there is no possibility of attaching a probability. We can say it is likely that there will be such a pandemic. We cannot say the probability that it will break out in Wuhan in December 2019 is not point something or other, any more than we can say the probability of a war is any particular number. We live in a world that is characterized by radical uncertainty of that kind. So what should we do? What do we do? Well, firstly, we need to rethink the ways in which we actually approach uncertainty. Next slide, please. Uncertainty arises because essentially we have imperfect information. Imperfect information about the past, the present, the future. Some kind of uncertainties are resolvable. And resolvable uncertainties are resolvable in one of 2 ways. One is where the imperfect information is knowable but unknown. And that's the case in which further research may illuminate the problem for us. That's when we do as we did only rather belatedly in the pandemic. We actually undertook surveys to see what the incidence of the disease in the population is, and to estimate from that the reproduction rate which determines its spread. Other uncertainties are resolvable probabilistically. Typically, the stationary processes which I described at the beginning. Archetypally, probabilities are used for describing gambling. That's how probability theory came into being in the 17th century. And there we know what the probabilities are because we know the nature of the underlying process that generates the data, which unfortunately we don't know. Some uncertainty then is resolvable in these ways, either probabilistically or because it's knowable but unknown. Even if it's knowable but unknown, the information may be insufficient for action. We describe in the book the case of Barack Obama deciding whether to send in the SEALs to the Abbottabad compound in which bin Laden was believed to be hiding. And because of intelligence agency failures during the Iraq War, these agencies were told to express their findings in probabilistic terms. So the key question was, is the man whom spy satellites have observed in the compound bin Laden. And Obama was faced with estimates of that which ran from 25% to 95%. And at the end of it, the discussion, he threw up his hands and said, look, guys, it's a flip of the coin, isn't it? It's 50-50. By which, of course, he didn't mean that the probability that the man was bin Laden was 0.5. What he meant was that he didn't know and had to make a decision anyway. That was a kind of radical uncertainty. And radical uncertainty arises because the problems we typically face are ill-defined and vague. We face radical uncertainty when we can't describe what the range of outcomes actually might be. We can't talk about a probability of inventing the wheel, because if we could imagine inventing the wheel, we already would have invented the wheel. Or radical uncertainty arises, and this is true in almost all our problems, because we're facing worlds that are non-stationary, non-ergodic. They're going to change during our planning period. So what we need to do is make the distinction which Keynes was emphasizing, distinction between risk and uncertainty. Risk in ordinary language is something bad. You never hear people say, there's a risk I might win the lottery. You don't even hear them say there's a risk I might not win the lottery, because people don't realistically expect to win the lottery. People are uncertain about lotteries, but that's not in the sense risk. Risk is something bad. Risk is something that derails what we call the reference narrative of our plans or our lives. Uncertainty may be either good or bad. When we go to a new restaurant, meet new people, make new friends, go to new places, the outcomes of that are uncertain. And they may be either better or worse than we'd anticipated. But risk is where something actually goes wrong. And what we need to do then in our lives and our plans is, on the one hand, to embrace uncertainty, and on the other, to achieve protection against risk. And the way we protect ourselves against risk, against having our plans derailed, is by thinking in terms of robustness and resilience. And I hope in the last year, people have started to think a lot more about robustness and resilience than they did in the decades that preceded it. Because the way we've achieved robustness and resilience is very largely by modularity and by redundancy. Redundancy meaning we build insurance. We have greater tolerances than the minimum we think we could get away with. And modularity means that if part of a system or a plan fails, that doesn't bring down the whole plan. In the last few years, people, especially in business, have tended to regard modularity and redundancy not as insurance policies, but as signs of inefficiency. And I hope we're starting to rethink that particular story. And finally, we protect ourselves, or we handle uncertainty by means of what I call disciplined pluralism. And this relates so much to what Lawrence said at the beginning in terms of the ability to fail. Next slide. I've always cherished this because it came from a British civil servant who was explaining what I think is absolutely the opposite of disciplined pluralism. In many of its dealings with other bodies, he said, the electricity industry finds it difficult to speak with a single voice. It seeks to obtain one consistent and considered and consistent view on a large number of topics. Chairman obviously often cannot speak with authority on behalf of the whole industry. Worse still, he may be able to state a range of views or give those of council members. That's the opposite of disciplined pluralism. It's a certain kind of public sector thinking, which is not pluralistic. You seek a single voice, but it's also typically not disciplined either. That means there isn't honest feedback on what is happening, and it's only evident that a policy has failed much longer after the event. In fact, this was said in the context of British electricity, and it was only in the early 1990s that we understood just how much money had been wasted in the British electricity industry over the previous 30 years when we tried to privatize it. People discovered at that time that you could lie to Parliament and ministers. You could not, however, lie with the same impunity to the stock exchange. There's a depressing thought there that we might want to pursue, but that was how the truth of what had happened in British electricity actually came out. Contrast that, next slide please, with how the computer industry actually evolved. The great success story of the last half century was a story constantly of people trying things, most of which didn't work, and being swept aside by people who engaged in different experiments which did work. IBM, astonishingly, created the personal computer. It's an interesting story how that came about, because the IBM bureaucracy had to be bypassed in order to do it. But then, having created the personal computer industry, it actually failed to take advantage of it. Microsoft determined the standard for the industry. Steve Jobs attempted to develop a standard also, kept it proprietary, and failed. Essentially, Apple was bankrupt after 20 years. But then Apple made a comeback, and the story goes on like that. Ken Olsen, who ran digital equipment and led the market for small computers, famously said, there is no reason why anyone would want to have a computer in their home. He certainly didn't understand that in 2020, everyone would have a computer in their pocket. The story is not of people having visions of how that industry would evolve and planning how they came about. The story is one of constant experiment, much of it unsuccessful. The story, essentially, of disciplined pluralism. Can we do better in the public sector? Well, I showed you earlier in this talk the Chowder Deli. I happened to pick up also a recent photograph of the Chowder Deli. Could we see it, please? It's been remodeled. The remodeling opened in March of this year. And if I were to take that photo today, it would actually be deserted because of the Indian lockdown. We don't know whether this project is going to be successful or not. We do know that it has a very different appearance and may indeed succeed in combining the unplanned interactions of the classic chowder with the parks, greenery and spaces of the cities we would like to see, even if they might not be the cities we would ideally live in. This may succeed, it may fail, but it's an experiment which perhaps if it succeeds will be reproduced in other cities as well. That's disciplined pluralism in operating. Let me end with one or two last words. It's to say that once we've distinguished between risk and uncertainty, and when risk is managed, we can embrace uncertainty. If there was one takeaway from what I've had to say today, it would be that. Manage risk in the way I've described, through robustness, resilience, modularity, redundancy, and then embrace uncertainty. Because what Keynes and his contemporary Knight recognized was that it was actually uncertainty that created the dynamic, both in our personal lives and in our business and economic lives. Manage risk, embrace uncertainty. There's probably no one ever expressed this better than Orson Welles. And if I can give the last word to him in the next slide.
In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock.
One could disagree with quite a lot of what is said there. But the core point, which is to say that if you can manage risk, you can welcome uncertainty, is the one that I would like to leave you with. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor K. Thanks for the vision. Thanks for sharing your thought. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for the honor to have been with us. I have a question, but maybe maybe if one of you, because we only civil servant from the UN, from the European Commission, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll give you the floor. If not, I'll also use the fact that I'm a German to give the floor and the question to Aggie and Lawrence, maybe they want to intervene.
No, let's take. I think it's better if we take questions from the floor first. But it was a fascinating presentation, but people who've been listening and then perhaps come in the questions and answers later. But let people put their questions first.
So can we? Okay, I see one hand. It's we're all using different system, so we're not using. Okay, super. Manal, I mean, I think you raise your hand, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks a lot for an interesting presentation. I think, Professor, going through it, we had so many questions and looking into the relevance and the relativity to us and to our lives and to our professional roles. But I think you summed it up by the very last slide that you presented, and here where my question is. How much personal characteristics and an environment in which we operate impact actually our capacity to manage risks and uncertainties? I mean, the last slide gave us relatively the answer, but any further elaboration on this thought, particularly on the capacity and the capability to manage the risks, and if there are any individual, the upbringing, the education, the culture, the background, or it's just as we are built, we become eventually.
If one kind of unpicks Harry Lime's arguments in that, I think it becomes more interesting, because actually, as I indicated, you can't quite agree with that. Switzerland actually, despite what Orson Welles had to say, Switzerland actually has more Nobel Prize winners per head than any other country in the world. The Italian Renaissance was incredibly productive and is really part of what has shaped not just European culture, but also the Italian and European economies subsequently. Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci were people who lived through the terror of the Borgias and so on, benefited actually from the philanthropy of these people, but they themselves actually operated in a relatively secure environment. I think I can't remember which is which. One of them lived to a very elderly old age. Both of them died in their beds. And both of them had patrons who enabled them to produce the works that we're all familiar with today. Switzerland, on the other hand, gives people a degree of personal security that has enabled people to take kind of risks, which means Le Corbusier, as a matter of fact, was a Swiss. Einstein was also a Swiss. Rather a lot of people who have emerged effectively from that particular environment. It's back to this theme of, if you can manage risk, embrace uncertainty, go for it. And that's as true in our personal lives, it's true in science, it's true in art, and it's true in the economic world.
Thanks so much. I see we have a question from Fulvio. Fulvio?
Thanks a lot, Vin, and Professor K. Thanks a lot. It's really an honor. I was very much impressed from the example you made about Boeing, because I think it's quite telling about the the modern narrative in terms of private economy, in particular private business, which is the interest of shareholders. That seems to reflect, let's say, a measure of efficiency, or is presented as a measure of efficiency. But in the example you made, in reality, it's not only, it's not a measure of efficiency in the end, because what happens in the long run is that Boeing had crashes. So what seemed to be something that was for the profit of shareholders in the short term, and instead of being for the public service, the service of aeronautics, ended up being not a public good, and in the end, neither serving the real interest of shareholders. Is this a correct, let's say, way of reading that example?
It is a correct way of reading that example, and I could reproduce that example over and over again. I might talk, for example, about the pharmaceutical industry, which has actually been one of the great successes of business serving society. We've discovered since the Second World War, we've put into production antibiotics, vaccines, a great many items, and saved millions of lives. And pharmaceutical companies have also made a great deal of money in the course of doing that. George Merck, who ran Merck for some years, famously said, "Medicine is not for the profits, it is for the people." And the better we have remembered that, the more the profits have come. And Johnson & Johnson famously has a credo, which says very much the same thing. But the pharmaceutical industry lost its way in large part, and in the last 15 years was characterized by people taking it over, price gouging, eschewing fresh research in favor, essentially, Me Too research, which was designed to produce drugs that had essentially the same therapeutic properties, but were chemically different from drugs which already existed. The result of that was in 2019, in the United States, of all industries, the pharmaceutical one was the lowest favorability rating of any American industry. And that's a contrast, say, with the period in the early 90s, when year after year, the company that topped Fortune's list of America's most admired companies was Merck. Interestingly, in the latest survey of favorability ratings of American industries, pharmaceuticals has notched up a point or two. The success in vaccines has improved the image of the industry, and so it should have. It's one of the remarkable achievements of business in 2020, but it's still pretty near rock bottom. So yes, I could tell that story again and again. I could tell it about large manufacturing companies, General Electric, General Motors. I could tell it about retailers, Sears and Marks and Spencer's. I've told it in a fairly extended essay about ICI and GEC, which were most of the 20th century Britain's leading industrial companies, and both of which essentially destroyed themselves in the misconceived pursuit of shareholder value. So Boeing is not an outlying example. Boeing is an illustration of something that has happened right across our business sector over the last 50 years. Great businesses and profitable businesses are maintained by people who build great businesses. It was essentially discovering that led me to, on the themes which I've been describing, to think about obliquity and to realize radical uncertainty. Companies can't successfully manage to maximize shareholder value because you don't know how to do it. You can build great businesses. And if you do build great businesses, as George Merck understood, the profits will follow.
Thanks so much. As people are shy, but we're here to interact with Professor John. I mean, let's take a question from Lawrence.
Oops. Thank you very much, Professor. I'm sure you've seen and advised many prime ministers and government figures in your time. In my career, most prime ministers in particular love to come in and think that they've cracked the new way to run government. They set up a nudge unit or some similar fashionable body to guide new thinking. What, as we've talked to the tabula rasa and going forward, our job is to, in particular, advise the governments of these 6 Eastern Partnership countries. What would your advice be to them on how to better manage risk and embrace uncertainty, and how to embody that in how one organizes government, which is often the challenge. It's not the challenge of an individual doing so, but it's how you can better embody that in the work of a whole approach to government. I'd be very interested in any thoughts you have on that, please. Thank you.
I think actually, Lawrence, you made a key point in your introduction there, where you talked about being ready to fail. And if you take my theme of disciplined pluralism, it is to say that we need to be ready to experiment, but we also, most of all, need honest feedback in that experiment, so that experiments that are working are imitated and experiments that are not working are terminated. Much of the public sector is actually very bad at both these things. The pluralism, it's reluctant to experiment, and when it does experiment, it often does so on a very large scale. And then there is difficulty in getting honest feedback, because people at the top like to be told that their rather grandiose plans are going well. There's a story I've told once or twice about Khrushchev's maze. The history is of Khrushchev going to the United States and believing, first visit there, believing that when he was shown around supermarkets, they'd been specially stocked for his visit, as they would have been if someone was visiting Russia. But then he saw the fields of maize, which went into the infinite distance, and he knew that couldn't be faked. So he got the idea that the Soviet Union should rely a lot more on maize. So there were large-scale introduction of maize instead of wheat in parts of the Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union. And the experiments were not very successful. But the line which I love to take out of that was one report that said, under socialism, maize can be grown anywhere. It can't, unfortunately. But that's exactly what I mean by the absence of honest feedback. And I think we all know that that's all too characteristic of large bureaucratic organizations. It's disciplined pluralism that is what the market does relatively well, and the public sector often does relatively badly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Professor John, we're running a little bit outside of the time, so, but if you have 5 more minutes, maybe we can go and continue some questions, Professor.
Yep, sure.
Okay, perfect. So I see a question from Como. Please, Como.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Professor Kay, for this inspiring presentation. As I found yesterday very much inspiring reading your book, Obliquity. One question I would ask is whether you could consider looking for chaos in a way, for complexity in a purposeful way, as a way to promote innovation in general, and whether the state has, in general, having the luxury to fail more easily, as also Lawrence was referring to, whether the state is in a way sometimes in better position than the private sector to fail, looking for innovative, apparently strange solution. And I remember in your book about the oblique line defined to build, for example, the Panama Strait, whether that is a risk that the state can more easily face rather than the private sector. Thanks.
I think we know that kind of basic blue sky research has to be public sector funded because no one else will. Although I've been struck looking at the history of innovations in the 20th century, how large a role private philanthropy also played in that kind of basic innovations. The Rockefeller Foundation, for example, funded the development of penicillin in the late 1930s and the Green Revolution in agricultural production 30 years later. And in many ways, it means that it leaves one feeling that the Rockefeller Foundation may have made more of a difference in economic terms in the long run than John D. Rockefeller did. It's an extraordinary record in that sense. And but basically, fundamental research, blue sky research, has to be done by people who have no great commercial interest in the work, in the results of the work. But the truth is that what motivates the kind of people who make these kind of discoveries is typically not financial reward, but the joy of making the discovery. The phrase obliquity, as a matter of fact, came to me from James Black. Black's a man who won the Nobel Prize as a pharmacological chemist. His background is that he was an academic who was recruited by ICI in Britain, and he worked in the ICI research department, and he produced their beta blockers, which were the first effective hypertensive drug. He actually moved then to SmithKline, another British company, where he discovered Tagamet, which was the first effective anti-ulcerant. And shortly before the end of his life, I interviewed him and asked, why did you move to SmithKline? And he said, oh, that was easy. The management of ICI wanted me to go on road shows selling beta blockers and antihypertensives. What I wanted to do was carry on doing research. So I went to SmithKline. And then he shook his head and said, I used to tell my colleagues at ICI that if they wanted to make profits, there were easier ways of doing it than drug research. And he shook his head and said, how wrong could I have been? I think of it as the principle of obliquity. And I thought, that's the phrase I want as the title of my book.
Thanks a lot. Maybe we take one more question of Giulio. No, we don't hear you. Mute, Giulio.
Sorry. Thank you very much for the lecture. In your book, you talk about the importance of asking this question, what is going on here? This is maybe building up a little bit on the question of Lawrence. We talked a lot in the last year with policymakers that are asking themselves exactly that question, right, facing COVID. I was just wondering, what kind of advice would you give specifically in the public sector? I think you touched upon some of it in terms of how we can all get better at answer that particular question when faced with a situation that is really difficult to comprehend. Thank you.
I think one thing that influenced my thinking in these areas was seeing the difference between the legal style of reasoning, which is also the style of reasoning of the historian, versus the kind of model building, which was the tradition I'd been brought up with, having learned economics, taught economics, built economic models myself. The importance of abductive reasoning, that is, of piecing together bits of evidence to try and find a compelling story of the events that happened. That's what a good lawyer does. And the best lawyers I've come across are people who are very good at doing that kind of thing. People who you throw disparate bits of information at them and they meld them into a coherent story. That's what the great historian does as well. And I think what we've failed to do in our planning, and certainly in the way we structure our economic thinking and our economic modeling, is we've tended to favor deductive reasoning. That is, deducing from first principles what it is we should do, rather than realizing that we're dealing with essentially unique situations and trying to understand what is going on here. I was just talking with my co-author, because we're writing a new preface to Radical Uncertainty. I was just talking about recent events. Now, COVID is something that it's an event of a kind that has happened regularly in the same way as financial crises do. As I said at the beginning, pandemics are something we know will happen. And we even know something about the shapes of uncontrolled pandemics. But that doesn't mean we know about the particulars of any specific pandemic. And it's that balance between, as it were, the model and the particularities of the situation which we need to look at. On the other hand, we were also talking about something like Brexit, which is essentially a unique event where there aren't historic parallels one can look to lessons for. I've come to learn that the way in which we approach economic problems is there are three styles of reasoning in the terms of the American pragmatic philosopher Peirce. There's the deductive, the inductive, and the abductive. The deductive is physics, the inductive is typically the doctor or the biologist, the abductive is the lawyer or the historian. Actually, to master economics and the kind of political problems you've all been confronted with, we need to use all these different kinds of styles of thought.
No, thanks a lot. There are questions in the chat, and I had a question, so maybe I'll merge the two questions. One was from Stanislav from the delegation in Armenia, and he wanted to know how do you see that us in the public sector interact, collaborate with the private sector in better embracing uncertainty? That would be his question. And maybe I'll ask my question after, and as I take the privilege of chairing the meeting. Thank you.
Right. I think if there are any silver linings to the pandemic, it's actually seeing one or two effective public and private sector collaborations, noticeably in vaccines. And what we've been doing there is providing money for basic research and assuring private producers that if they come up with the goods, there will be a market for what it is they produce. That's been a way of combining the resources of the public sector with the disciplined pluralism of the private sector. And it's worked out rather remarkably well. Someone who just got his second dose of vaccine a few days ago, I can feel that at the moment. That's, I think, the immediate lesson we have as to how these things can be done well. It has to be a partnership. It isn't a matter of leave it to the state or leave it to the public. We know that neither of these things work.
Thanks a lot. And maybe let me ask a question on another dimension. So I read your book, Obliquity. I loved your book. This is why I'm so pleased that you accepted to come. And I talked a lot about your books to my kids, and which I love doing. I express that. Talk about work with my kids. And talk about Obliquity, they kind of agreed that the world, their personal life was uncertain in many ways, and they rebound. But then when I tried in the European Commission to explain, to try to condense, to explain your book, and we had a seminar, and Lawrence attended, I was surprised by the fact that adults, not kids, were saying that no, their life is not uncertain. They kind of plan, they know what's their goal, they know where they're heading to, it's built. And And I thought this goes a little bit against the line of your book. How would you react to that type of comment?
I think if we had asked Einstein or Leonardo or Steve Jobs, would we have had that answer? And I think I'll leave it at that.
Super, but very inspiring. Thanks a lot. It's amazing to have you on this today and to be able to launch a very critical partnership. So we thank you. We will now move to something a little bit more bureaucratic, but we have and thank you, Professor K. Maybe we can go a round of applause. I don't know if it works on Zoom, and you can, but really, thanks a lot. I'm really happy you could come, and it was an honor for both institutions and for everyone. So, you're more than welcome to stay with us. And see how we will decline maybe your vision and what we talked about into a reality of a 10 million contract strategic partnership. But in between, we have also the pleasure to have Giulio from UNDP, who is working on innovation, and it will in a way branch and make the link between the philosophical part of it and maybe one step further. How do we move in this project? And then we jump into the project that I hope will embrace uncertainty, as we talked about, Professor K. Giulio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ben. And please have sympathy for me coming after Professor K. I can only disappoint from boring UNDP. So trust in your sympathy for that. What I wanted to do is simply talk very briefly about our journey of trying to embrace complexity and uncertainty, certainly not in the same sophisticated way that the professor talked about, but embedded in our way of operating. And it's very much an ongoing journey. And the project we are launching today is very much a critical part of a journey. And this is why I'm so excited to be here. So if I can take you for a second to the other side of the world, this is the city of Da Nang. It's a city that has tried to very successfully establish itself as the new Bali. It's got a flourishing tourism industry, but it also has one big problem. It has one big landfill that is about to be completely filled. The waste leaks into a beach. And is threatening all the last 20 years of economic development. On top of that, like in many other cities in Southeast Asia, there's lots of informal waste pickers that are trying to make a living out of this. And so when the government announced that they would try to shut down the landfill, the waste pickers were immediately up in arms. The one solution that the local government has been offered is from China, is an incinerator that would actually make the level of pollution worse in the city. What you see here is one example of a type of challenges that we have when working with cities or governments that are very complex, right? So they start from what ostensibly is an environmental issue, obviously leaks into an economic issues, a social issue. And the issue is that when you're trying to deal with it, who do you go and talk to? So in our case, we started with the environment department, where these are engineers who are not necessarily trained or interested in talking about the economic aspects or the social issues. How do we actually help a city like this to take better decisions to tackle on such a complex issues like this? Same thing, you can take Harare, where we're working on food markets in informal the spike in lack of food following COVID, or you can go to Skopje, talking about one of the cities with the worst air pollution in Europe, perhaps even in the world. All of these are examples of this type of complex issues that makes it quite difficult to answer what is going on here, right? So this is an example of a system for COVID. Look at how the different issues are interrelated, and what starts as a health issue clearly has implication for economic, environment, and beyond. So the question is, how do we tackle this effectively from a public sector perspective as UNDP? And the issue that makes it so difficult to answer some of these questions is that, this sentence is quite famous. I think you've probably seen it many times before. The tools that we have to understand and act on these problems come from a different century, and they're not really equipped to embrace the level of complexity and interrelation of these issues. And plus, we are structured in silos. Citizens live horizontally and government lives vertically. And this results often in a situation that looks like this. We have fantastic plans, but then, of course, struggle to meet reality. And because of that lack of feedback loops that the professor was talking about, often we continue on a plan before actually accepting that reality actually go in a different direction. What this leads to is, under political pressure, quite a lot of magic thinking in solutions that solve very complex problems. Think about contact tracing for COVID, that was at one point it heralded as the magic solution under enormous amount of pressure. Think about smart cities to solve really complex social issues in cities. These are all issues, solutions that are not really coherent with the nature of a problem that we are dealing with. So for us, the journey, very briefly, and again, this is the journey that we think very much a project we are launching today is part of, is to really start asking ourselves, what is our intent when dealing with this type of issues? What do we want to bring to cities, communities, together with us and ourselves? And really, one of the things that we want to do is, when you're dealing with a situation as complex as this, is not to reduce your options. To try to think that a technology fix, a single point solution can actually tackle these complex issues, but actually expanding the options that are available to us. This means having different tools to understand the world and different tools to adapt, to learn, adapt, and act accordingly. So just to give you an example of what we mean when we start thinking about how do we develop a new intent politically, and also how do we create new possibilities, back to some of the introduction that Lawrence was talking about, the tabula rasa. So imagine if you're a city, this is how we explain it to our colleagues, but also to municipalities, and you advertise a job that looks like this. We'll digitize our processes and reduce the time for citizens to get a driving license by 30%. Well, this might look a really good thing. As an Italian, I can promise you'll be very happy if that's what happened. But imagine if the same job was actually advertised this way. And I don't know, Professor, probably you'll tell me this is completely wrong interpretation, whether one can be interpreted as an oblique or non-oblique type of objective. But the one on the right is really speaking about moving into a completely different paradigm. One on the left looks at an existing paradigm and just tries to do it a little bit better. Now, the issue, of course, is when you say we want to move to a paradigm like the one on the right, the difficulties of a level of complexity is much bigger. How do you build political will to go there? How do you actually create possibilities to go there? And part of the reason why this seems so daunting is we often think about moving to a different system as being a revolution from one state to the other. In the reality, there's a number of options that are already available, that are already the future that is already here, but not very evenly distributed. And so the question is, if our intent is to bring to policymakers new options, new possibilities to deal with these complex issues, how do we help them, or how do we work together to learn about these options that are available to them and expand the possibilities in their toolkit? So we've been a big fan of following what the work of Innova has been doing in cities. And as you know, part of this new rethinking completely cities after COVID is the 15-minute city. Innova is actually talking about the 1-minute city. And one of the things that they've been doing is to look around cities and stakeholders to look at what are the options available to actually make the one city happen. And where the options were already available, they identified them. And when they were not, they are trying to create for every street in Sweden prototypes that demonstrate what are these new possibilities. Another way to rethink completely systems is, this is an example where looking at 3D printers that build houses and cities, turning the regulations into code so that it can be embedded automatically in the 3D printer. So every time that the municipality code is changed, the code is updated inside the 3D printer, and the city and the house is built according to specifications automatically. It's a completely different way of imagining how regulation is being done. So part of this issue then is, if you want to create the will to explore new options, is also to institutionalize this way, or this process of creating new options. You probably know Bologna is the city in the world that has a civic imagination office. As a result of COVID, they, for example, redesigned city delivery so that they are actually beneficial to the gig workers rather than exploiting them. So we created a cooperative for ethical food delivery. One of my last jobs was with the Prime Minister office in the UAE. We created the Ministry of Possibilities as a way to embed inside bureaucracy the possibility that it's actually, we can look and explore different type of options and make them available when dealing with complex issues. So I talked about intent and really the possibility of providing decision makers and ourselves with new options in the face of complexity. This also means starting from a place of understanding issues in a different way. I will not say anything anymore about the limit of quantitative thinking alone based on what the professor said, but this was my conversation with the government of Thailand. They were asking me how many jobs are going to be automated. And they had a report that confirmed to them that the number was X. And then I show them this piece of research from the MIT that look at all the projections done by all the big consultancies with their projections of how many jobs are going to be automated. And the conclusion from the MIT was actually, we don't know. The same conclusion that I guess Obama came to when the professor was talking about. So if that is then quantitative judgment, we cannot rely on it exclusively, or rather only in part to orient our thinking. We need to complement it with a robust qualitative judgment. So one of the things that we spend some time in developing is something what we call a sense-making protocol, which is trying to help walk through and answer this question, what is going on here for decision makers when we're faced with very fragmented projects and activities, siloed, and bring a coherence to do that. And this is one of the approaches that we want to bring to the project that we are starting today. Same thing, you have heard about deep listening, so I will not go into this. Is really looking at the micro narratives, the dominant narratives in a particular location to see whether they provide new opportunities for intervention. This is again one of the approaches we want to try through this project. This is just an example of how we used in the south of Thailand, in the municipalities where there is conflict. Ethnic conflict, and one of the things that we did is we looked at the narratives, dominant narratives across the different communities, and where there seemed to be lots of common energy to rethink a different future was actually around food. And so at the moment we have a number of chefs from the Basque region that are working with them to reimagine the future of a municipality, looking at the future of food systems. Final thing I wanted to say, so I talked about a new intent, right, to providing new options, even in the face of complexity, playing with new ways or exploring new ways of understanding issues that allow for these options to be surfaced. And then the question is exploring new ways of acting and adapting. This is, in a sense, the type of thinking that we are trying to explore through our projects. How do we change from a column on the left to a column on the right? And how do we actually accept that having objectives the way that Boeing put them may not be the best way to actually deal with complexity, but our log frames and where all of our systems are actually trying to drive us there. How do we accept that we cope with emergence? How do we accept that we might not have all the solutions, but actually probes to try to better understand the complexity of issues we are dealing with? So one of the ways in which I explain the concept difficulty of adapting for ourselves is I don't know if any of you is a doctor. This is 3 heart readings. I don't know if anyone wants to guess. Out of this, 1 heart is healthy and 2 of them are unhealthy. Anybody can guess which was the healthy heart?
In the middle, maybe?
Yeah, well done. Super. And the heart in the middle is healthy because it actually is flexible enough that it can adapt to the circumstances around it automatically. Now, the difference between a heart that does that almost automatically and organizations, so, you know, I often ask then which one of these you think is UNDP, right? The difference is that in organizations, it takes an awful lot of decisions to make that shift between saying we did that yesterday, we learned this thing, and therefore we do things differently tomorrow. And this, of course, is also very political in many different ways. So once you realize that your reality is quite different from your plan, who takes the decision that tomorrow we're going to do things differently because we learned that? How does that work? How do you organize the will inside an organization to make that decision? And that is really an extremely complex thing and one of the things that we are exploring. Part of it is how do you build also a muscle to adaptive thinking, right? Adaptive thinking, the way that the professor was talking about it. So for example, we just completed 8 simulations in 8 cities around the world, including Yerevan, looking at how we can train policymakers and ourselves for one-offs, for things that are completely unexpected. We used alternative reality to do it as a way to build a muscle to start thinking and having conversations. And again, back to how do you create this narrative, common narrative, what is going on here? How do you build that mental model that actually allows to have robust qualitative conversation complemented with data to start saying what is happening here in a situation that you've never seen before? So we exposed people to increasingly level of unlikely events, and they need to take decisions to actually decide collectively what is going on here and how would we actually react. And the second thing is back to, you know, not relying on single point solutions, to start thinking about our interventions as portfolios, right? A set of connected interventions that learn from each other over time. Often our projects are extremely siloed. They don't talk to each other, and they're certainly not designed to tackle many different parts of a system in a coherent logic. So this is coming today from Skopje, where our colleagues are actually starting to design a portfolio of experiments looking at what happens, how to tackle waste, building on some of the principles that we just talked about. And again, this is very much a work that we hope to see happening through the project. We launch it today. Just to say that we have, for us, the journey is very much ongoing one. Right? All I've showed you is very much work in progress. We're still making quite a lot of mistakes and some failures, but we're also learning a lot in terms of how to do this. We have 9 of what we call deep demonstrations around the world, where we are trying to test these things, new intents, new way of understanding the world, new ways of adapting and learning accordingly. And of course, we see the project we are launching today as part of this journey. I just wanted to end on 2 things. One is about mindsets. And one of the interesting thing for me is that if you accept, I think, the concept of radical uncertainty, and if you do accept that we're dealing with really complex issues, this will never be a finite game. This will never be a 5-year project. This will never be something that has so beautifully finished, in the sense that we're dealing with complex issues. You have this mentality that this is actually a game that will continue, because we always will learn about complexity. We'll keep working and understanding and improving our world this way. So again, this is very much a type of things that we hope to explore through a project, a new way, providing new options in the face of complexity, rather than locking ourselves to reducing our options, providing new ways of understanding issues and new ways of acting and adapting. This is our journey we are going on, and we are extremely excited to be on this journey together with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Giulio. So after the vision, the different vision we had, and of Professor K, of Giulio, let's see, and this is why we'll move into the next phase about the action plan, that what we're going to do for the next year. And the program, it's a 10 million euro program. It's indirect management. There will be call for proposal on all the words that we all know. Let's see, with our tools, with us knowing the limitation and how we can do, how can we start thinking about, I'm not sure it's a new approach or it's more a branding or something we should have done for a long time, maybe. And let's see concretely how we can learn and say down the road in 5 years, this has been a success, we've learned something, and we can further continue the journey. So now I have the privilege to give the floor to Laila. I mean, she's the mind behind the project. Laila and Tina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and really just to iterate what others have said before me, it's been a great honor to listen to Professor K. I am extremely delighted to have come to this point where we have an internal launch for the project and actually get to start doing the work. And what I think that means for us, a little bit inspired from that Boeing quote, I thought, well, this is what we really want to do. We want to eat, sleep, and breathe for a different future. And maybe that sounds now a little bit cheesy, but I kind of feel that is that we need to think about this, rather than say, we're going to build effectiveness and efficiency in the things that we do. So Tina, maybe to the next slide. So what others have said it before me, there is a particular, I think what we've heard from Professor K, what we heard from Giulio is really how do we broaden the way in which we understand, or how do we, what Professor K called disciplined pluralism, how do we apply that in the things that we do and bring in the knowledge and learnings that are generated across the different types of initiatives, across the different types of investment into and adapt regularly the strategy in the places where we work. And I think that's where we deploy portfolios. You'll hear, everybody in this group will continue to hear about portfolios quite a bit for the next 4 years, I believe. But what we're really trying to do is test a different way in which we understand complexity. And we are certainly much more aware of it, but also have a different way in which we respond to the complexity that we are now more aware of. And what that in itself entails is exactly what what Professor K said, which is where we need to continuously manage risk, but at the same time simply embrace that there's going to be a high level of uncertainty. In our case, the way that we will do this, we'll run a process of portfolios that will, a portfolio design and investment in portfolios that will ultimately in itself have a deep listening mechanism, as you heard Giulio say, but also continue to adapt based on what we're learning, based on how the strategy is evolving, based on how reality, most importantly, in the places where we'll be working with, will essentially be changing. It is, because of its nature, again, others have said it before me, I don't think our institutions are by default ones that are known for adaptation. We're big, both the EU and UNDP, but really, because this is a different way of doing things, because it is about discovery and it is about adaptation, I think adaptiveness, the success relies on the high engagement at all levels. That's regionally, at DGNIR, at the country level as well, and the genuine, continuous, honest communication and readiness to adapt based on what we're learning, what's happening in the countries. And the third point is actually connected to my earlier point, is that really see this as and the way in which we started as a new partnership that enables us to learn about new ways of doing things. So next slide, Tina, maybe. The overall goal of the initiative is the overall aim is to enhance inclusive and green economic growth and job creation through innovative and system thinking approaches. Maybe it's not oblique enough, but it is, we still have to function within the parameters of our institutions. And we'll do that by continuing to work with local governments and Eastern Partnership countries, and by supporting them to with essentially investments and capability development. And I think even if those two pillars are not significantly different from what a typical project would have, Tina, could we move to the next slide? The structure and the underpinning logic of what we're trying to do, I think, is fundamentally different from the ways in which we approach projects. There are three key elements in project or in program implementation, in project implementation over the next 4 years. One is that all municipalities, all local authorities that are part of the program will obviously have a chance to learn, to be exposed to on strategy, foresight, embracing uncertainty, understanding complexity, access to tools that have to do with deep listening, being able to tap into existing narratives, understanding what are narratives of transformation, having access to those at the municipal level. But then there is a process of what we've called, or there is a part of the project that focuses on portfolio design. And here, 12 local authorities or more, hopefully more, will have a chance or will be enabled to design initiatives that ultimately look at this should be diverse, but also that are ultimately connected to one another and that are adaptive over time and are managed dynamically over time, so that we look and learn for what is learning, exactly as Professor Kay said, and have an honest feedback in terms of what needs to continue and what needs to actually maybe end if it is not producing the learnings and the results that it is supposed to be producing. But ultimately these initiatives, or maybe not ultimately, but these initiatives will be based on deep listening methodology, understanding where the narrative and potential for transformation lies at the local, in the municipalities where we'll be working in, as well as what has potential for transformation ultimately, and then learning and adapting from that. So, and linked to that link to the project, or in the project, there are two calls that will be managed, two calls for proposals for local authorities that will be managed by UNDP, and a DG NEAR call for proposal that has already been launched, is already underway. So there's an envelope for both, and I think the partners and the delegations, everybody's kind of aware of the distribution there, so I won't go in depth around that. However, so there is a difference, or maybe there's not a difference, but what we're trying to do across the board and how we're not looking at monitoring and evaluation as something that happens at one certain point in time, but in fact, we're deploying the sense-making protocol. We'll be deploying the sense-making protocol and other learning mechanisms throughout the project and applying it to all the initiatives, applying it to all the investments that are made across the different funds, to make sure that we're not learning only from one of them, but we're starting to recognize what patterns are, we start to recognize where potential is, and ultimately we adapt the project, we adapt every year based on what we're learning on a year-to-year, in fact, it's not year-to-year basis, we'll be looking at a quarterly sense-making learning process at the local level and a semi-annual one at the regional level. So embedded in it is, how do we adapt? How do we understand complexity? How is the system effectively? How can we learn how the systems are responding to the initiatives that we are designing? And as a result of that, adapt each year as the new calls come out. So I'll stop here and hand over to Tina, who will walk through how this will roll out.
Thank you, Leila, and hello, everyone. Hi, colleagues. So as much as we would love to move away from linear programming, we still need to operate within a frame of a UNDP project. So now I'm just going to do a deep dive into this year in terms of the project, and then give you a brief update on where we currently are in terms of the implementation. So what do we want to achieve by the end of the year? It's not so much the intent, but these are the project indicators that we are going to achieve. I'm not going to reiterate what's on the screen, but what I could what I can say is that the first phase of the mayor's project from 2017 to 2020 saw a total of more than 400 local authorities that signed up to the initiative, and more than half of them developed local economic development plans. So of course we want to build on that and strengthen that network and the quality plans as well. So how are we going to go about that for this year? These are the key building blocks that we now are starting to work on. So the first one is adapting the current local economic development plan methodology. So we will, of course, build on already what exists, meaning there's already a fully fledged methodology in place with guidelines, with an online course, and you name it. But of course, we're going to adapt it through a new how, meaning applying a systems thinking approach. So these local economic development plans 2.0 is going to be complementary to other types of planning instruments. We're not going to replace them, similar to how they were in phase 1. And most likely it'll be 2 years in duration. All these things are, of course, to be adapted and explored as we see. We would love to make it a bit more, we intend to make it a bit more lighter in a process, leaner, and hopefully also move a lot of these tools online. There will be a very strong focus on co-creation among usual and unusual suspects. But of course, we aim to have a much stronger focus on green growth, just transition, and of course, stronger emphasis as well on access to finance for the public sector. So that's really the first key block that we'll work on this year. The second one is to establish a new urban learning program and center. So this, of course, is linked to adapting the LADP. So preparing LADP 2.0 will be an integrated part of this learning program. And the learning program is expected to have many how-to modules. Of course, the majority of that, or a big chunk of that, will be on innovative methods, such as sense-making and deep listening that Leila was referring to. So these will be online, in-person, self-paced. We're also hoping to have modules around leaving no one behind and gender and SDG budgeting, and also gender dimension in urban planning, among other things. So the idea here is that this is also going to be a virtual space to incubate new ideas and to share good lessons around urban transformation. And the other building blocks this year is developing a portfolio development. So we're now in the process of devising a selection process, which will be transparent and lean, to select up to 12 municipalities this year to undergo more of a deeper learning to begin designing portfolios. So I think there's portfolios is really just to simply put it in another way, it's one way, or as a practical way of seeing a development issue through a systems lens. So UNDP, we have many tools already in place here that we will now scale up and try further, including social system canvas, areas of interest, the listening tools and whatnot. So this will be a part of that portfolio development. And these portfolio cities, or urban transformation cities, will then have the possibility to access grants of most likely then 70,000 USD in annual call for proposals. So this leads us to this other key block for the project, which is to actually set up these 2 annual calls for proposals that Leila also spoke to. So the first one here is the portfolio call, which will be open then for these portfolio cities. And the second will be for an innovation project call, which will then be open for all members of the network. So together, these constitute about 4 million euro of the project. So hence in 2021, the intent is to set up the structure, the criteria, the guidance documents and whatnot, and then launch these call for proposals. So ideally, we will have an annual forum at the end of the year, most likely virtually, seeing the current context, where we then will also announce the successful applicants for the call of proposals. And the last block that we wanted to emphasize here in this very short presentation, which is perhaps maybe not as clearly stated in the description of action or project document, but really what the success of the project relies on. And Leila was speaking to this as well earlier, which is really about us as development practitioners. Arguably, there's a need to demystify thinking in systems and bringing the UNDP experience and the learning on portfolio approaches together with other partners from the edge and to the core. And this is really also for me personally an opportunity to step back and see something new, to be surprised and practice how to suspend maybe previous assumptions and try to look at something that may be familiar, such as local economic development, but from a very new angle. So it's a call to all of us. So where are we at now? We're now at the end of the inception phase of the project. So we're quickly going to show you what type of progress we've done so far. So of course, recruiting personnel often takes a bit of time, and the regional project team, and then in Istanbul, as well as the 6 country teams, are materializing as we speak. So hopefully within the month of May, we will have the relevant colleagues on board. On the screen, you see the relevant positions that are based in Istanbul and the ones that are based in at the 6 countries as well. And over the last 2 months then, we have supported the ongoing Mayors for Economic Growth call for proposals. So many colleagues are familiar with this. It's a 10 million euro that's open to all members of the network. So we provided 2 external assessors here, and we're working on the outreach to local authorities. And we'll also, through our country offices, provide technical advice in the preparation of the full project's proposals. We also conducted internal discussions around adapting the existing LADP methodology, and we're soon to initiate a procurement process for the provider here, and it will be combined with the urban learning program. And we've also begun devising the criteria and guidelines for selecting the municipalities for portfolio development. And here we are, we're lucky to have the head of Urban Transformation Cities Program at the Climate Kick Foundation to support us and help us out. So very quickly, this is what we would like to see then within the next quarter. So this is what we're aiming for. We would love to have the onboarding of the regional and country teams completed, to have the internal learning well underway, and to be ready to launch the call for interest to be a portfolio city among the members of the network. And we also hope to be well underway in adapting the current LADP methodology and the urban program. And that our country teams have initiated the national platforms. These platforms are for learning and validation platforms. They're not a decision-making body for the project. For that, we have the regional steering committee. And of course, we hope to have, this is an internal launch today. We hope to have an external launch with the network, an interactive external launch within the next quarter. So this was very briefly and quickly overview of what the key building blocks this year and what we plan to do. So of course, we're happy for your feedback. Time is running out. We're happy to, of course, to take any questions now as well. And if no time to address them, we will get back to yours in writing. What I wanted to say though, before I hand it back, is just to inform that we are going to organize a virtual steering committee where we'll share in detail the annual working plan, the inception report, and other relevant documents for comments over email in a week or so. So we'll be in contact with the members of the steering committee. And in the end, I just want to thank our UNDP colleagues in the 6 country offices for their support and flexibility in setting this project up. I think it's been highlighted many times already, but this is not a traditional UNDP project, although it's a bit of course, in the shape of a UNDP project. It's not prescriptive and linear. It has a lot of flexibility and unknown elements in it. So I think, as mentioned earlier, and in line with John's case comments, this is really a constitutive call for us to embrace that uncertainty and see it as an opportunity, and to feel empowered to step up in that space. So thank you for that quick run through. Over to you, Leila. Would you like to add anything?
No, I think over to Ben.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Before we go to further question, yeah, we wanted this launch to be different. I mean, we all know our institution are working at so many contracts together. I think in the Eastern Partnership, we have more than 150 million euro of ongoing contracts between the European Commission and UNDP. So here we're talking about a 10 million euro contract. But sometimes the amount of money is not what counts. And the success of this program is yes, the initiative and the fact that we will deep learn and test and pilot in 12 cities, maybe 50 cities, that's important. But the real success is that we work together, the European Commission and UNDP, learn from each other and learn this new methodology. This is why it's critical. The success is critically depending on the EU delegation, the UNDP office in the field, and this is why we want you on board. So we are going to be here to liaise with you, to build with you, to share knowledge with you. I mean, whether it's from the Istanbul office or Mathieu, I mean, the team that is led by Mathieu, that's what we'll try to do, the support we'll provide to you. And now maybe we have Aggie, and Aggie is back, but I wanted, as we, following this presentation, so we went from theoretical, a fantastic author, to still a vision of UNDP. And I think UNDP on complexity, you have walked many steps ahead of the European Commission. So we're really happy to partner with you. Now we trickle down into the reality of a project of 10 million euro, a structure, who is who. And maybe before I hand back the floor to our two heads here, do we have any question from the delegation? Because that's other offices in the ground, because that's, without you, we cannot do it. I mean, the transformation is a journey together. And it's more than 10 million euro. I mean, Aggie can confirm. I mean, we dreamed about it a year ago, and now it's here. But it's more than just the money we're putting. We also know that maybe today is a wrong day. It's quite late for you in your countries, and depending where. And it's Orthodox Easter also, but agenda of so many high-level people, Lawrence, Aggie, Mathieu, and John Kay, meant that we had the opportunity to meet here. So if our colleagues from delegation are shy and wants to just deep listen and take inside what they heard, and then we will have more interaction. The program is starting. We at the Commission are fully confident in the team led by Laila, and we're really happy with Tina. No question, Mathieu, I give the floor to Mathieu because he was together with us in Istanbul when we dream and hopefully we start, let's see, a journey together. Mathieu.
Thank you very much. And I mean, again, it's a very inspiring meeting. I mean, maybe people just need to think about it. I think I like very much, I mean, the way we approach things. I mean, we first start with theory, with thinking in a different way. And then we think about how to implement, how to translate that into a reality. And I'm sure, I mean, in next year, we will get already some good examples, I mean, that feed into our thinking, and the examples taken by Giulio might be coming from our region, which is what I hope. So I think this is very good. I want to insist really on it's a joint journey. It's a different relationship. It's not a donor implementer relationship. It's a partnership, and together with Aggie and Leila and Bin, I mean, we really wanted it to be a partnership. So moving together, working together at country level, I mean, delegation, UNDP country office, Istanbul, Brussels, really to work together. And the core that Tina was mentioning is a learning. I mean, is being in a position to learn and to get, and let's please not think about, I mean, the edge or the surface of the iceberg, which is, okay, how do we report and so on. Let's bring what matters for us, what matters for citizens. I mean, we're working for the citizens of the Eastern Partnership. So this is also an important dimension. Difficult for them to embrace complexity. It's difficult for us, it's difficult for them. But let's help them, I mean, through embracing complexity, let's help the Eastern Partner citizens to dream about tackling the opportunities and shaping a better future at local level in our municipalities. I think that's really our vision. Of course, I mean, we will go through reporting, through mechanics, through whatever, and that we have to do it in a way. This is the way we work, as Tina said. But I mean, the ambition is there. It's clearly framed, and you can see in 2 hours of a steering committee, we basically have only 10 minutes about the mechanics. Keep the vision, keep the focus. This is what we want to implement. We want that to be translated into reality, and we want to do that together. I stop here. Aggie, up to you.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. There's nothing to say after you. I think you said it all. I will just add one little thing, which I think is very crucial, or emphasize rather, because you said it. it really will be up to you at the country level to make this happen. So, you know, I think the vibe is very positive, and I hope that we all conveyed the vision and the expectations. At the end of the day, now we move on to implementation. So we need to roll up the sleeves and get the work done. And that can only be done if you at the country level, from the EU representation and our country representatives, are really taking this spirit forward and work hand in hand at the country level as well. So that basically the same approach translates into the day-to-day interaction of the EU and UNDP in the countries. So I will close it with that. And then I think from now on, it's time to work and get things moving. Thank you very much, Matthew, and Bin, enormous thanks for all your support and your enthusiasm to push us all forward.
Thank you, and have good Orthodox Easter then for this weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Really great to see all of you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.